If you or someone you know has a tendency to try and please in order to get what they want, then this video could be useful. The pleaser, which happens to be one of the defensive ways that I've tried to move through life, is very strong in me, has been very strong in me, and actually has been the architect of some of the bigger disasters in my life. So it's something I feel I really can speak about with confidence. And I can speak about how wonderful and freeing it is to actually get to know it a bit better and actually to start to loosen how tightly that runs me. The first thing I think to really think about is that, we have these patterns, of which pleaser is one, for a very, very good reason. So there can be a tendency, particularly as we become aware that we are doing a pleasing pattern, for example, there can be a tendency to criticize ourselves, to become very judgmental about ourselves and quite harsh. And there really isn't any need for that. It's a very, very powerful step to actually become aware that we are using one of these patterns. And it's very, very important to realize that it takes a lot of courage to do that. Now, the other thing about the pleaser is that it's actually, as with all of these patterns which are trying to help us survive and get through the world, it's actually a good skill, but it's just being misused or overused. And so what that means is we don't actually want to get rid of it. We just don't want to make that our only or one of our only ways of negotiating difficulty and dealing with things in the world. It has high costs and it impacts us because it makes us, as pleasers, do way too much for other people, not pay attention to our own needs. And it puts us into a place of inauthenticity with the other person because we're not in touch with our own needs. When we're communicating and pleasing, even if we're saying it's all for you, we're doing it for you, the essence of it is not. And that has an important result, which is that because we're not being true to ourselves, our self-esteem goes down. So even though it has some value in getting us something of what we want, our actual sense of ourself, because we're compromising ourselves and not acting from a true place, our true self-esteem goes down, more doubt. So it doesn't even really help us to feel that safe in doing so. And it impacts the other person because they will often not really believe us. I mean, they may do for a while or for a bit, but there's on some level, there's a kind of, can I trust this person? And when I'm in that pleaser mode, I am not being truthful. So they're right. So it impacts our relationships. So just to recap, firstly, we all have these patterns. They are full of good energy, but it's just coming out in the wrong place. But it does have these important costs to us. So there are lots of methods that you can use to start to work with this. The simplest are the ones which I really, really encourage people to get going with first. And that is just to start noticing when you're doing it. That is a huge step to move out of the unconsciousness about it, to move out of the denial. That takes a lot of courage, and it is a very, very powerful way to start to actually extricate ourselves from that pattern and that person and that identity and that set of relationships and that life that we've created from this pleasing place. And then once we have some awareness, we can start to gently explore choice. The prerequisite for this, and I mentioned this right at the beginning of this video, is compassion for ourselves. If we notice it with our awareness and then start to try and do something about it, but it's coming from a very judgmental place, we're only going to hurt ourselves and we won't do much to really soften the bonds that this pattern has over us. We can bring a bit of compassion and then gently inquire as to how we might do differently. We can start to then even take that into action. We can even say to ourselves, oh, I noticed that I really didn't pay attention to my own needs when I was accepting that particular job. I really didn't pay attention to it. Perhaps there's something I can do to actually work out what those needs are and then address them with the other person. And speaking of other people, we can always attempt repair in relationships. We don't necessarily have to say, oh, I've been a pleaser, I'm so sorry about doing that. But we can do the repair by shifting our behavior, by changing it. Now, importantly, these are patterns which have been around for a while, and so they are not going to shift overnight. And in fact, there are times when they can feel a little bit worse as we become more aware of them, a bit like a cold hand warming up. We get pins and needles and discomfort as it does so. So it's very useful as well, and part of the compassion piece, to take a longer term view of this. There's a lot of really lovely qualities, the empathy, the attentiveness, the care that the pleaser has. And they really are a superpower when they are coming from that true place in us. And of course, as we get used to acting and living from that truer place, we feel that our self-esteem shifts. And this is a virtuous circle that takes us into real connection rather than this rather second-class connection that we get when we're acting from one of these survival defensive patterns.